All right, welcome everyone to the panel Queer Stories Writing Our Way into Belonging, part of Outright 2023. Thank you so much for tuning in. First, we would like to thank Gilead and the Mayor's Office on LGBTQ Affairs for their continued support of Outright and all our Center Arts programs. Their support allows us to continue to share our stories regardless of the artistic medium. So please join us as we thank them for their support and play a brief sponsor video.
The average baseball stadium holds about 50,000 people, enough to fill a dance floor the size of a New York City block. It was also the number of people in the US who became HIV positive every year since 2003. Then, something happened. One by one, we said, enough is enough. Instead of waiting for a cure, we took action. We got tested and retested. We talked to each other, and we talked to healthcare providers about HIV prevention options. People living with HIV started treatment right away and stuck to it, which can prevent the spread of HIV through sex. New infections went down, but we still have work to do. So let's all do our part and keep fighting, because together, we can all help stop the virus. Find out what you can do at helpstopthevirus.com.
Thank you, and please enjoy the event.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Dale Lofton, and I am just beside myself with joy to be on this virtual stage with Nima Avashia, Curtis Chen, and Jennifer Savrin Kelly. And we're here to discuss queer stories and what it means to write your way into belonging. First, we want to thank the incredible team at Outright DC for their guidance, their support and kindness, and a special shout out to the DC LGBTQ+ Center, Gilead, and the Mayor's Office on LGBTQ Affairs for everything they're doing to make Outright DC possible. We're not going to read our biographical sketches because we want to take that time to devote to the conversation. So our bios will be in the chat feature, and we invite you to take a look at those and if you like, and then reach out to us, connect with us if you like. So we've reserved some time at the end of the session to answer any questions you may have, and you're welcome to drop those questions into the chat feature, and we'll address those at the end. But to begin, each of us will read a brief excerpt from our works to give you a sense of the stories we're telling that reveal yearning to belong and the path to acceptance. And Nima Avashia will begin.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm going to read you just a short excerpt from my essay collection, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place. This excerpt comes from an essay called Only Generation Appalachian, with grapples with the definition of like who counts as Appalachian and who doesn't. So I'll start reading. There is this other complicating factor in my relationship with Appalachia. For as many ways in which West Virginia embraced my Indian family, inviting us to dinner, teaching us to garden, driving us to practice, making us part of their lives, it also rejected me regularly through the words and actions of people who were profoundly racist, who spit and slapped, threatened and harassed, used ice and cowbells and urine to let me know I did not belong. I don't just feel like an imposter in a room full of self-identified Appalachian writers because of my own insecurity. I've also been made to feel like an imposter time and time again. But in some ways, I also know I do this to myself. I put myself on the outside. I was 3 hours from Charleston at this writer's workshop. I could have gotten into my car and gone to see Mr. B, my adopted Appalachian grandfather, yet I chose not to, because I didn't know how to face him after his election-related posts, because I've lost the ability to see him, and he has lost the ability to see me, and we do not have blood or coal dust or weddings, funerals, and family reunions to force us to find our way back to each other. Am I from here or am I not? It depends on who you talk to and when you talk to them. It depends on what has happened to me in the moments before you ask the question. Thanks. And next up is going to be Curtis Chen.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to all the organizers for putting this together. I'm going to read an excerpt from my upcoming memoir called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, which will be published by Little Brown on October 17th. The memoir is about growing up in Detroit during the 80s, a very terrible time for the city. It was crack, it was AIDS. I personally knew 5 people that were murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite all this, we had this really wonderful Chinese restaurant in the inner city where my parents were able to raise us kids, and give us teach us the values that we needed to sort of move forward in life. And so I'm going to read the very beginning, the prologue, and it deals with this issue of belonging. So, so just going to dive right in. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain, that's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa Gong Li had faced this same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young, impoverished family. For here or to go? For here or to go? As I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our most popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best-selling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so the rest of the story goes with that fundamental question of, do I stay in this crazy family, with wonderful Chinese food and all my siblings, or do I go off and find my own way? And so that's the book. And again, it's coming out October 17th. And so now I'm happy to introduce Jennifer Savin-Kelly.
Thank you, Curtis and Nima. I loved hearing you read your words out loud. So I'm Jen. This is the book I'll read from that came out in February from Algonquin. It's called Endpapers, and it's a novel, and it essentially tells the story of a genderqueer bookbinder who finds a love letter hidden underneath the end papers of a book, and it's a queer love letter, and becomes obsessed with tracking down the author of that letter. So I'm going to read an excerpt from very close to the beginning. My genderqueer bookbinder is an artist and has been suffering from artist block because they really haven't been able to figure out themselves, and therefore having a hard time expressing themselves. And so this is near the beginning when they are looking through a recent artwork and feeling very discouraged. Turning the pages, I scan my drawings. The window washer proselytizes from his platform high above the street, squeegee in hand, dripping water onto his adoring masses. A pretty teen angel responds to his question. Yeah, I'm a good girl. Such sadness on her face. The police officer rounds up porcelain dolls from the street, exquisitely dressed toy girls blocking sewers, mailboxes, and fire hydrants, donning signs with feminist slogans. Behind the officer, more cops attempt to go about their business with arms full of dolls announcing, "My body, my choice. The future is female. Resist." Somehow it's not working. The renderings are competent and the scenario is interesting, but none of it has anything to do with me. I've been trying to find out what can happen, what I can make, if I forget everything the world wants to see when it looks at me. But under these bright fluorescent lights, my images only remind me once again that I've become more invested in hiding who I am than expressing it. Heart sunk, I brush my bangs across my forehead, the way the woman who cuts my hair instructed. More feminine, she'd said. Good girl. Am I, though? I wonder, to the empty room. Good. A girl. Thank you. And next, I'm very happy to introduce Jeffrey Dale Lofton, who will read from his wonderful YA novel that is still on hold at my bookstore.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. So I will be reading from Clay Suzie, and it's actually more of a crossover from young adult to adult novel. So it's in that space that's really good for younger people as well. So I'll set it up for you very briefly. Clay Suzie is the coming of age story of Philbert, who is born gay and with a skeletal malformation of the chest, and into a conservative family and community in the Deep South. He's fueled by tomato sandwiches and green milkshakes, and his world is shattered by a series of events that crush his innocence and fragile sense of security, which makes him believe he is not worthy of being loved by Knox, the older boy he idolizes to distraction. But over time, he finds refuge in unexpected places and unexpected ways. And in this brief scene, Philbert thinks back to his younger self when he's 6 years old, and he's sitting in his Southern Baptist church looking around. That boy had an identical twin brother who was like him, but not like him. And their physical similarity only made their differences more striking. There was, I looked to where they sat, 2 pews ahead, with the mama, the daddy, and the perfect boy seated in a row, evenly spaced shoulder to shoulder. But looking made my throat hurt. And that was because the sissy child was next to them, but about a shoulder and a half width away, breaking the perfect, equal, but close distance, and signaling to anyone paying attention that though the sissy was right there on the same pew, he was alone. And it dawned on me that all those whispering kids called me the same names when I wasn't around. And I expect he, a fellow outcast, thought I kept my distance from him because I didn't want to be associated with his kind. Or maybe he kept his distance from me because he heard them talk about me. Each of us longing for a friend, but too afraid and hoping we were not like the other. But I was his kind, and he mine. The truth was, I didn't even think he'd want to be my friend, because I was worse than a sissy. Thank you for allowing us to read excerpts from our works. So I'm going to start us off with a question. And it's kind of a longer question, so I'm going to sort of break it up in 2 parts, but ask it all the same in the beginning. So as queer people, what does it mean to belong in the world? And the second part of that is, how does literature amplify both the longing to connect and the connection itself?
Well, I'll start. And it just interestingly, I'm actually going to start by talking about someone else's book, because I've been reading Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H. over the last week. And it just strikes me just how much I both relate and don't relate to what's in here because of my cultural background and my race and those differences. But then there's a lot of crossover in terms of queerness and in terms of how I came to Judaism, how you learn by learning a different language just so you can read the Torah, and here you're learning a different language just so you can read the Quran. But it's striking me more than ever as I read this that there are so many ways to belong, and there are so many different ideas of what it means to belong based on your culture, your race, your background, your socioeconomic status, whatever it is. And that, again, that there was so much I could relate to here and so much I couldn't, but because I'm pansexual and I'm genderqueer and I've never fit neatly into a box and have never had this sense of real belonging, therefore in the queer community, it was really striking to me to read a book by somebody who, had short hair, wore boys' clothing, is a lesbian and yet still wasn't reading to people as being queer enough. And I thought, and again, it's because of, I think, a lot of cultural differences, so there was just this idea that I feel like I've always sort of struggled with personally about what is queer enough. And this is just bringing to light a lot of those issues from looking at it from other lenses. So I'm just really interested in hearing from all of you about your experience. I don't know that answers the question or raises or just amplifies the question, but it's been on my mind a lot.
Yeah, I think the idea of belonging has always been something that I've thought about as a middle child, trying to fit into my big, crazy family. Where do I fit in? I actually have a shameless plug. I have a short story that appeared in Bon Appetit that just got selected for Best American Food Writing. It's going to be coming out this fall, but it deals with this subject. And so there was this one night at our family's restaurant where the old Chinese men were all meeting to figure out how to deal with all the crime, because people were targeting Chinese restaurants. And at some point in the evening, a bunch of gay white guys saw our lights were on late, unusually late. And so they tapped on the window, and I'm panicking like, no, don't let them in, because, I don't want these two sides of my world, being to sort of collide or intersect. And I think that's just, as a person of color who's also queer, it's just always trying to find that space and wondering if, there are different places to belong, and how do I find a space that actually incorporates all of it, so I don't have to pick and choose and, as they say, code switch or, in different situations. So I think that's something that I've always had to deal with.
I appreciate that, Curtis. I think that that's something I think a lot, which is as somebody who's queer and Desi and Appalachian, the number of people who share those intersections of identity is a very small group of people. In fact, I only know one other person who sort of like holds those spaces. And so for me, I think belonging is always largely about not belonging or being in spaces where like one part of me is seen, but the other parts of me are not seen. And the like adolescent in me always feels like the parts of me that are not seen are the parts that scream really loud. And so I think for me, kind of pointing to the second part of the question, like writing is a way of belonging. Like you write your way into belonging, right? I never had books who mirrored who I was. So I had to write one in order to have a space where I saw all of me reflected back to me. And I think that for lots of folks who live intersectional lives and have intersectional identities, like that can be the role of literature. Literature is both a place where you can create belonging for yourself, and literature is also the place where you can find belonging. Because since writing and publishing this book, there are all of these people who are reaching out to me who, might not be Appalachian, but are queer and Desi and from the South, or might be Appalachian and white and queer, but like there are elements of belonging that they're finding in the book that they hadn't seen in books before. And I think that's really the power of literature, is in its ability to build belonging for writers and for readers.
I think I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to add that for me, what you say, Nima and Jennifer and Curtis, resonates so deeply, because belonging means feeling safe and appreciated and seen for everything that you are, your foibles, your great qualities, everything. But because I spent the first several decades of my life feeling alone and broken and worthless on the inside and the outside. And so that breeds insecurity and frustration and anger and heartache, and it's just wasted energy. And I believe that, so we talked about, when we met earlier to talk about this session, we talked about responsibility. And I believe that getting to the literature part of it, I think that queer writers have I believe it is our responsibility to create works that to uplift and show a path to get through it. And sometimes you have to write that story for yourself, because I didn't see a story that I needed exactly like I needed when I was growing up. But the responsibility I felt was to write one more story, an affirming story that can show the path. That's a responsibility, I think, and that's the power of the literature when applied to this sense of like, what does it mean to belong, and how can we belong ourselves and help other people belong? Jennifer, I think you were gonna.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting something that I was going to say about one of the things that struck me about this book that I'm reading now, and that I was feeling when I was writing my book, was that it can be very difficult just to express to people through coming out, or in any way that when you want to tell people, look, I'm queer, right? I have this queer identity, and it can feel so scary. And then when you finally do it, one thing that you don't expect, and that I didn't expect, is to have people not necessarily believe you, or question that you're telling them the right identity. And I think one of the beautiful things about writing is it gives you a voice also, which is a sort of responsibility as well, right? It gives you a voice to say, this is who I am, whether you believe it or not, right? And there was something about publishing a book about being queer that I felt the people in my life suddenly see me that way more than they had before. And I realized just how much people need that, not, the readers and writers. Because it's, and again, that comes back to the question of queer enough, are you fitting enough into the queer community? But also there are straight people who don't believe you. Maybe that you're just seeking attention or whatever it is, or you're just confused. So, yeah.
That touches on the concept, the act of coming out, and so there's coming out traditionally, or whatever version of that is for you. But what about the idea of inviting folks in, inviting your community in, your world in, your family in, instead of coming out? What does that mean for you all?
Yeah, when I was writing my book, I actually did not approach it as a quote unquote coming out book, because while that it does cover the time periods of my life. So my book is 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and 8 in college. And it definitely covers all that struggle of my sexual orientation identity. But an even bigger part of it probably dealt with my racial identity, growing up in Detroit, which is a very black and white city, but then also, being a first generation college kid going to a predominantly white institution. And because my book deals so much with family dynamics and my family struggling to survive, Detroit and the difficulties of that city, is that when I was writing it, I was not writing it necessarily as a coming out story, even though it's a strong element within it. So this idea of inviting in, resonates with me, because it really isn't about me leaving that family or abandoning that family, which oftentimes we think of coming out as that's the process, right? You're leaving a space. For me, it was sort of how to integrate that identity, that queer identity, into the pre-existing space of my family. So that's what I was struggling with.
I think that inviting in is also, I think when you're a writer and you're writing about gender and sexuality and race, any of these things, you are inviting people in a way more than you're coming out, because you're bringing them into proximity with your experience and your identity and your own vulnerability, right? And it's through doing that I think you create relationships with readers. You offer them sort of a vision for like what might a possible path for them. You help them to know that like the questions that they have or the struggles they have are ones that you're also thinking about. It's a different act, right? Coming out is about sharing it with often with intention with a person or a group of people who you have a specific relationship with. Inviting in is like, you don't really know who that audience is. Like it's anybody who picks up your book. And so it really is, I think, a very different way of thinking about how we're orienting. Like this isn't just my personal experience that I'm sharing with someone who I know, right? Or helping them to see me in a different way. This is me saying to like everyone, like, come on in. Like, this is my story. Come be in it with me.
Yeah, and there's also maybe even a third, there are probably many more categories of this, but when I think of the concept of inviting in, I think it's almost predicated on being among others who make you feel safe and supported. And if you don't have that, then it's probably quite difficult to invite people into your life. And as writers, there's maybe a distance from us and the people who read it in the example that it might show. But sometimes people are, they're forced out. It's not a choice. They don't come out. They don't invite in. It's not in their control, especially public figures, I suppose, or maybe not even public figures, but maybe a community. And there's the queer person is sort of exposed in some way. So coming out is probably an act of, I think of it as an act of bravery. What do you think about that idea of inviting in, maybe not in our literature, but just in one's life?
Well, I mean, that from the excerpt that I read, I mean, that's the whole idea of a Chinese restaurant. You're actually, bringing people into your world, you're feeding them, you're welcoming them into your home. I think that's just a philosophy I've always had in life in general, of how I approach people. I want to engage with people. I want to make them feel comfortable. And how that reflects within my writing and my life journey in writing a memoir about it is that, yeah, definitely. I feel like, again, I'm inviting people into the world of this Chinese restaurant, where the narrator is a queer Asian kid, who has certain, understanding of the world based off of, that experience. And so, yeah, I definitely want people to come and stay and, feel comfortable and, as they say, come again. That's sort of like one of the last lines in my book is like, come again, because I want people to return over and over, to my book, just like a good meal or a good restaurant. So definitely, I feel like that's what I wanted to do. I want to expose people, who might not be familiar with, what's it like growing up in a Chinese restaurant. So.
Yeah, and for me, I think what has been tricky for me is that there has not been language in the mainstream for so long to even understand. I mean, I came out as bi when I was in college, and this idea of inviting in and, telling my family this is who I am, and, hope you'll choose to hang around, But with the whole idea of realizing that I was genderqueer came through writing the book, because I didn't have the language when I started. I didn't know that people identified as non-binary. I had been, vaguely aware of people using different pronouns. And I had always been genderqueer. I just hadn't had a word for it. And so when I was writing the book and I started learning the language, it was hard to think about inviting people in, because I was figuring out who I was and how to even have the words to describe it to myself. And so really it was through the book that I was both coming out and inviting in. And I was afraid, having to explain myself a lot, when I found out it would be published, because, to be in your 40s and have people say, well, why are you just telling us this now? It's like, well, I didn't have any way to know or explain it before. So that was a very interesting piece. So when I think about coming out, inviting in, it was just such a long process of even figuring out what it was that I wanted to say. Yeah.
That brings another question to mind about that period in our lives as writers before we actually shared this with anybody. You can liken it to before you shared your innermost thoughts and feelings with your community. So thinking of that time, that period, that phase of our writing careers, before we allowed anyone else to read our works, what changed to make you share your work with other folks? Like, we made a decision to come out at some point, or invite others in. We made a decision to share our work with others as well. What was the point that you decided? What was the catalyst to make you decide to share your work with others?
Well, I've always been a professional writer, but I've written, more fiction and narratives of others. But to write my own story, my own memoir, that was a switch for me. And it really started because, after my dad passed away and my family moved out of Michigan, moved out of Detroit, a place that my great-grandfather had moved there, great-great-grandfather had moved there from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, and then up to, before realizing there weren't Chinese people down in there, and then moving up to Detroit. But we had this long history of being in Michigan, long before there was a Ford Motor Company or even Motown Records. And so I felt like that was a history that I wanted my nieces and nephews to understand and to know, because they don't have that understanding of that family history, because they're all in California now, right? Which is a completely different experience than, say, growing up Asian American in the Midwest. And so that was my impetus, was really getting down, my ancestors' stories, but really my story and my siblings' stories of what it was like growing up in the 80s in Detroit. And so it was really started as a family story, something to share with the family. So
I think for me, I kind of think about it as like the stories got too heavy to hold by myself anymore. And what I mean by that is that, I was watching people build these narratives about the place that I was from that were like very false and very painful and harmful to people in Appalachia. And I was watching what continues to be like a growing crisis around the mental health of South Asian young people. And sort of watching these things build and build and build these, and trying to figure out, like, where are the counter narratives? Like, where are people pushing back on these definitions? Where are people trying to talk about things that they see people don't want to talk about? Where are the sort of visible representations of these hard and difficult things that we need to grapple with? And I would see some of them, and I would see myself in parts of them, but again, I was never seeing the whole. And I felt like it just got too heavy to hold on to. The questions were too much for me to just keep to myself. I wanted to know that other people were thinking about those questions. I wanted to find those people. And I wanted us to be able to share space with each other and be able to think about those questions together. And that felt too important to just like let the story sit as mine. It felt like I needed to invite other people into those questions, because the problems are big. And there's a lot of damage and harm that's happening. And the only way to counter that, I think, is to bring it all into the light.
Yeah, that's very well said, Nima. I remember there was a moment for me as well where I was, I had published other things, but I had not written anything specifically about being queer. And I write fiction, but I always dislike answering this question because I hate bringing up Trump. But it was when Trump got elected that I realized, so I never felt queer enough. I never felt like I had the right to tell a queer story. And when Trump got elected, it shifted something in me where, rather than feeling like I'm not queer enough to tell a queer story, I thought, with all of the laws that are being, either proposed or passed, with all of the violence being done against the LGBTQ community and trans folks specifically, that I wanted to be an ally. And I felt like the best way I could do that was to come out or invite in, so that there were people in my life who I knew were conservative and I knew were supporting Trump, and I also knew loved me and had no idea about my queer identities. And I thought, if I can somehow, there must be other people in that position. And if I can somehow tell my story in a way that will make people realize that queer people are not who you think they are. They're not always what you think they look like. They're not always living the lives you think that they're living. Like, when you are at that ballot box, you think that you're making decisions for people that are nothing like you, that are not part of your community. And so I just felt a responsibility, I guess, to tell my story and say, so that's who I felt in a way that I was telling the story for, and also for other people like me who always felt that they were not queer enough. And it has been interesting because since the book has come out, I have heard from both of those audiences, from people who have been happy to see themselves represented in a book, and also from people who've said, thank you for helping me develop more compassion, for helping me understand. I've gotten some not so great reactions too, but those more positive ones have made me feel like, oh, that very conscious decision I made at that very specific moment in time, I felt, I feel okay. It was scary. So I feel happy to have made the choice, but yeah, it was scary.
There's so many different directions to go from all of all of what you shared. But before we go in any of those directions, I'll say that for me, the turning point was, I started writing this book many years ago for myself. It was healing catharsis. I've come to describe it as an exorcism by exposition. There were years of anger and frustration and fear and humiliation just forced down inside of me, and all that started to come out. So I started to write about it for myself. But I realized at some point in that first draft that I wasn't doing it for myself as much as I was writing it for other people, to other people who are struggling now, as I did years ago, when I was younger. People who live their lives on the outside looking in, I think of us as fringies. I self-identify as a fringy, and someone who looked into a world that never matched what I felt deep down inside of my heart. And so I intended Great Clay Suzie to be a roadmap of self-acceptance, to help those fellow fringies maybe have an example of, a path forward. So that's what it was for me. But in those answers, you talked about what impact did you expect to have, responsibility to, and we're going back to responsibility to our queer community, not feel, and generally a sense of being an outsider, which is a universal feeling in a lot of our work. So I think our works resonate with readers who are not of the queer community as well. But let's talk a little bit about the impact that you wanted your book to have, your writing to have. What impact, you talked a little bit about, what you've heard back, but what impact did you intend? And if you heard that?
I think for me, I think there was like dual impact. I don't live in Appalachia anymore. I haven't for the last 19 years or so. And so part of what I wanted is for people in Boston and in New England and outside of Appalachia in general, to not be able to think about Appalachia the same way anymore, which I always like to say, even if you don't get past the cover of my book, the cover is a bunch of Desi people standing in front of a grist mill in the fall in West Virginia. And it's like, even if you don't get past the cover, like it's going to disrupt your understanding of Appalachia. Because if you thought Appalachia was not home to immigrants, if you thought Appalachia was not home to queer people, like the title and the picture already upend that, right? So there was like one intention of challenging those assumptions and pushing people outside of Appalachia to get closer and get more proximate and build stronger understanding of who lives there and what their lives are like, and how much love and care there is in that place. And then I think I wanted people in Appalachia to pick up the book and see themselves in it, and feel connection and feel a sense of home and feel recognized and seen in literature in a way that doesn't always happen for them, because so many of the stories that are told and that get lots of visibility are not Appalachian stories. And sometimes the one Appalachian story that sits on the New York Times bestseller list for 56 weeks is not one that people actually in Appalachia think is particularly good. J.D. Vance. So it was sort of dual purpose, right? And I was in West Virginia yesterday at a queer youth summit, which was a beautiful thing. There were queer kids from all over West Virginia who were all together at a summer camp. A thing that never happened when I was growing up, didn't exist, right? And these are 14, 15, 16-year-old kids who are maybe very alone in their schools, but then are seeing that like oh, we are here. And I read to them and I'm reading to them. And one kid's like, that's the street I grew up on. And another kid goes, well, that person was my teacher. And a third kid is like, wait, I had this same experience with my hair, right? Like, and there are just all these ways in which resonance is happening, geographic resonance, queer identity resonance, like this way in which I think young people feel seen. In a book that like we may not share all the intersections of our identity, but yet like you feel seen, like that to me both felt like what I was trying to do, but also feels like the thing that is happening. And that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I love that. I wanted to shed light, and that's what that sounds like. Like I wanted to shed light for people who are genderqueer or figuring out or non-binary. I wanted them to see themselves, in a book as the main character. I wanted, again, to show people who are maybe a little bit more conservative or maybe more progressive, but just don't understand. I wanted to show them a picture, a fictional portrait, but I wanted to show them a picture of somebody who has these feelings and what is that like? What's one version of that? And then I think the third thing that was important to me, and I realized this as I was writing, was that I didn't want my protagonist to be a very neat, likable, perfect character. And it was definitely risky. And some of the feedback I get is about the character being unlikable. But it was very important to me not to have the character be like a perfect model of queerness in order to earn compassion. I really wanted to show that people are just messy and we all deserve compassion and dignity or respect or whatever you want to call it, because we're human and not because we're queer or we're straight. And so it was important to me not to polish up the likability of the main character. And again, yeah, it was a risk, and I'm happy that I took it. Yeah.
Well, my book isn't out yet, so I don't know what kind of response it'll get, because I also don't have any reviews yet, except Publishers Weekly did name it one of the top 10 memoirs coming up. So hopefully that's a good sign. But, when I pitched it to my agents, as a book I wanted to write, I was, worried that our country seems to be very divided right now. We live in the little silos where we don't talk to each other for a variety of different reasons. And I felt like Chinese restaurants are one of those few places where you can actually walk in and see people from different races, socioeconomic backgrounds, religions, sexual orientations. And I wanted to take that opportunity to sort of have a conversation about these really important subjects that our country's going through, or dealing with, whether it's racism, homophobia, class issues. But I want to be able to do it in a way that's fun and draws us together and doesn't push us away. And so I jokingly said to them, it's like, come for the egg rolls, but stay for the talk on racism. And that's sort of what I want. I mean, I don't know if it's a lofty goal to hope that my book can in some ways be a conversation starter, a place to bring people together. I don't know. I mean, I hope that. I go back and forth as to whether or not I think I'll be able to achieve that or not. I just don't know if the divides in our country are so deep that even a small book may or may not be able to impact that. I don't know. So
that's wonderful. I think that we have similar expectations, or had similar expectations before our books came out. And for me, I wanted outsiders to everywhere, not just queer people, but outsiders everywhere, to feel less alone. And, people who feel the sting of bullying and body shaming and hatred and racism and whatever it is that makes them feel alone, to feel less that way, to see that there is a road to acceptance. And so we keep coming back to the word responsibility. I felt my responsibility was to create a story like that. And in fact, to point to resources for at-risk youth. And so part of the proceeds of the sale of Clay Suzie go to the Born This Way Foundation and the Trevor Project to support the really important work that they do every day to not just enrich the lives of at-risk youth, but to save them. That's the impact that I wanted to have. And And that was my intention. I will mention, so we're coming up, we have about 15 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, if you want to submit those into the chat, we'll be happy to answer those. But I don't think we have any questions at the moment. So let's keep going. We keep coming back to that word of responsibility. Should we talk about responsibility, what that means to be writers? Do we have a responsibility? What does that mean to our queer communities, both where we live now and maybe where we grew up, or just the global queer community?
I feel like I have a lot to say about this just because I've thought a lot about, I know that for queer stories and also stories about race and other ways of being marginalized, there's a call for and a need for stories that are of joy, right? And that it's a radical act to write these stories of joy and not always write stories of trauma. And I felt when I was writing my book, because it does deal with some traumatic events, I thought, oh my gosh, what is my responsibility here? Who do I have to please with this book? And I agonized a little bit about it. And in the end, I decided that I had to write the story that was in my heart that I had to write. And if it had some tragedy in it, then and some hate crimes in it, then it was just something that I had to write. And I have definitely heard from readers who've been very disappointed with that. And I've heard from readers who relate to it very much. And so I do feel like there is a lot of pressure when you are representing, right? When there are not a lot of books out there with queer main characters or queer memoirs, that there is a big responsibility to sort of be the representative of the community. And it does put a lot of pressure on the story. And, I want to write joyful stories. In fact, my next book that I'm working on now is a story of queer joy and strength. I mean, bad things happen, but not because of the fact of people being queer. And so I have a desire to tell those stories as well. But, you realize that one book can't be everything for everybody. And it is hard. It's not, I don't take that lightly. It's not my way of saying, therefore I have no responsibility, but also there is an aspect of that, right? When you're writing one book from the perspective of one person, from one particular culture and upbringing, and I brought as much as I could of other cultures and things into my book. But at a certain point, you have to say, okay, this is the book that's in my heart that I'm writing. And you hope that someone who needs another story is maybe writing that story, So yeah, I'm curious to hear what others have to say on this too.
Well, I think my situation is different because I'm writing nonfiction, right? And so my only responsibility in my head was to myself and the truth of what happened, right? Like, for instance, even the good and the bad, it was important for me to show that. And, like in the book, I was a Republican back in the day, and I called myself like the Asian Alex P. Keaton, you know what I mean? And I did really stupid things. I was not a very nice person back then. And so for me, I just was in writing it, I just was so worried that I got down everything, quote unquote, right. That I remembered it correctly, that the people had the attitudes that I thought they had, or that I remember them having, and things like that. So I couldn't fabricate or worry about how I would have liked me to be a better role model, or how I would have better behaved. All I could show was who I was, and maybe chart the journey of how I became the person who I am, which is a person that I like far more than the person I was at the beginning of the book. And as long as I remain truthful to that, right, then I feel like that's the only thing I could pay attention to, I think. So
Yeah, I think similarly to Curtis, I feel like I think I in particular felt a responsibility to be very specific and detailed about the intersection that I live at, and not to necessarily take bigger swings than that, because because I think that's like part of what's been a problem in terms of sometimes the Appalachian stories that do get lots of visibility is they paint with a very broad brush in a way that excludes many, many, many different people who live in that space. And so my responsibility was to be as specific as possible in sort of building the world that I lived in and to invite people into that, but not to claim that I knew something more than I do, you know, and I think that's disappointing for some readers. I think some readers pick up my book and are like, well, I want to know about this group that lived there and this group that lived there and this group that lived there too. And I'm like, cool, I can tell you who to read, but I cannot write that book. Like, that's not my book to write. Those books exist. People have written them. I can point you to them, but it's, you know, not, I don't think I'm the right person to tell those stories. I can only tell the story that I can tell, which is mine. I think that the other responsibility that I feel like exists, or that I feel, is to think about the power that I have in that I'm the person telling the story, and to be really clear about how that power gets wielded, and to think about what it means to hold people in your writing with empathy. Because ultimately you are determining how they get rendered on the page, and there isn't equity in that. Like, they don't get to say their perspective. They don't get to say how they experienced it, right? You're rendering it. You're rendering you, and you're rendering them. And so I think sort of that the responsibility of thinking about empathy, or the role of empathy in our writing, feels like a really important one, both like extending empathy to self, which I think is a really important thing to model as a writer of nonfiction, which is like, what does it mean to give yourself grace, and to sort of like be able to talk about the mistakes you've made, talk about the things that maybe didn't go the way they should have, talk about those sort of missteps and errors from a place of care and empathy and grace, as opposed to like critique or condemnation. But also then, what does it look like to try to exercise those muscles when we think about how other people engage with us as well?
Yeah, that really makes me think of, I wrote my novel, the subtitle is a novel inspired by true events. And I wanted to make it clear that I was writing a novel, but it was based on my experiences, which gave me the opportunity to tell a different version, to explore alternate stories, to right wrongs, to see what it might have been like if I had had the courage to make different decisions, if I had been stronger. But I also wanted to sort of let people know that it's okay to tell your truth. And this was my way of doing it. And so, and I mentioned the Trevor Project earlier. They do a survey, and they have some really staggering statistics. 41% of queer youth seriously considered killing themselves in 2022, and 14% actually attempted it. And when I read that, it's shocking to me. And so I felt a responsibility to, again, put a story out there that is affirming and has this sort of, I hope, roadmap built into it as to how to find your own truth and your own path. But this question actually, in your responses, brought something to mind that we discussed as a group a little earlier when we met, and that is this idea of expectations from your community. So, you know, the queer community is, you know, it's not just, it's you know, it's a 10% of the population, we might, you know, estimates say. So because there are fewer stories, there are more now than there were years ago when we were growing up, but there are fewer stories for this group. And if you further divide that, if there are some others, queer and disabled. So for that population, there are even fewer books. So there's a responsibility to get it right, so that this smaller group who don't see themselves in literature that often see stories that are really, meet their needs, meet their expectations. What do you all think about that? And we have about 5 minutes left. I don't think there are any questions yet, but let's let this be our last discussion point, maybe.
I think for me, it comes down to wanting to tell more stories of empowerment and of joy in queerness. And again, that doesn't mean the stories always have to be joyful and that everyone has to be empowered at all times, but to show, again, for me in fiction, what I want to see, reflected back at me, which is queer people living lives from a place of empowerment, joy, and letting the instability come from other things. So right now I'm very committed to that project, and I'm also very inspired by it. So a lot of the writing that I am doing is exploring that. And it's felt good to me. And I think as a queer writer, that's what I need. That has to be my gauge, right? Because if you try to write for an audience, like if you really try to write for an audience based on what they're telling you specifically that they want, I think that it won't be your work, right? At some point, you have to write from what inspires you and from your experience. And so it's a kind of dual inspiration, that these are stories that I think are important for the community, but also stories that are inspiring me at the moment. And again, I just hope that part of our responsibility in writing these stories and getting them out there, I hope, is that other people will feel inspired, right? And write more stories, and more stories will beget more stories. And, meanwhile, the conservative right is trying to ban books. Publishers are continuing to publish more and more, and especially for children. So I think that the more stories that are out there and the more readers are reading them, the more that we all have this shared responsibility, and it doesn't rest on a few individual authors from a few very specific backgrounds to try to tell stories that will, serve that purpose for everyone. Yeah.
Well, I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about the publishing industry and say, I think it's great that there are more opportunities for queer writers to get published, whether it's with the big five and academic or independent. So I think it's great. I think one of the challenges, though, is because the audiences that might naturally gravitate to our books have not been serviced in the past, right? And it hasn't been developed in terms of how to reach out to them. I think it becomes an extra challenge for us to figure out how to help develop that audience. We know they're out there. We know there are people out there who want to read our stories, right? But maybe the avenues in terms of connecting us to them isn't as strong. And I think that's something I think about, is like, how can I work on that? How can I help develop that audience for more queer Asian stories or queer stories in general, right? And so events like Outright are a key part of that, right? But how do we help groups like Outright, the Center, help develop that audience? And that's something I'm really looking forward to, because I do think it's an exciting time now to be a queer writer.
I think that's so on point, Curtis. I mean, I think that part of the challenge we have right now is the narratives around publishing, I don't think align with the realities of reading, right? Like, how many people will say to you, oh, short story collections don't sell, essay collections don't sell. And I'm like, are you kidding? People's attention spans in this era are like 15 minutes long. Like, short story collections would sell if you tried to sell them, but you're not trying to sell them. Like, you're not marketing them as what they really are, which is like exactly the shot of dopamine that we all are used to getting from our phone. You could also get from a book, right? I think that's kind of the challenge, is that, and this is, I think, kind of like really connected to just the notion of queerness, that like queerness is about, I mean, Bell Hooks says this, queerness is about like the idea of like being willing to ask the question of like, is the way we're doing it the way we should do it? Is it the right way, right? We're all asking that question. I'm not convinced that that is a question that gets asked when mainstream publishing has found sort of like strategies that make money for the people at the very top and like rip off everybody who works in those entities, right? But they figured out a strategy to make a buck at the top. And so that's the strategy they keep doubling down on. Whether that benefits writers, whether that benefits workers in publishing, like, we're clear that is not necessarily benefiting the majority of people, right? When we give enormous advances to a few writers, that's less money we have to support the work of so many people who are trying to do this work. And we've seen that, like, so often those advances are not going to folks coming from marginalized communities. They are again and again going to the same small group of people who keep benefiting. And you do have queer writers, you have writers of color, you have working class writers who are like trying to figure out how to tell their stories without that institutional support. And I think it is kind of like the place that we're in is the place of being able to ask the question and being able to keep pushing the stories and saying like, you don't think, my mother-in-law is from Brooklyn. And when my book was coming out, she like went to some Brooklyn bookstores to try to convince them to have my book. And she went to one bookstore and she came afterwards and she's so mad. She called me. She was like, they said your story is too niche. And I'm like, well, okay, like, too niche for Brooklyn. All right, whatever, right? Like, but like that notion is a problem, right? Why do we think that stories are niche? Like, why don't we have like a reading and writing community where like the idea of specificity is what excites us? And the idea of specificity is what we're seeking in story. And I don't think that's about writers. I think that's about marketing. I think it's about profit and capitalism. I think readers want specific stories. I think readers want nuance. I don't think that's something that publishing always wants to give them. And I think we're in a position to keep pushing down that road of specificity and nuance and saying, like, if we write these stories, like readers are going to come to them. Like we can believe that, we know that to be true. And so we're not going to play to the other thing, which is these like generic broad stroke stories that might sell on some level, but don't actually compel readers in the ways that we know that they want to be compelled.
That is such a beautiful way to end our hour together, Nima, Jennifer, and Curtis. So call to action, keep pushing, ask questions, create the world that you want to live in. That's all the time we have, but thank you again to our sponsors and host. But most of all, on behalf of my fellow authors, I want to thank all of you today who came to join us, who will watch this on the recording, to celebrate the LGBTQIA+ community in all its forms and manifestations. Thank you so much for letting us